and I'll turn it over to Alan.
Thank you very much, Karen, and I do also want to thank you and tell you how much I appreciate your joining us here today. I know all of you are busy and have many things to do, and I appreciate your concerns for our community. I know many of you are also having to do extra duty thanks to Hurricane Harvey, and some of you have businesses you haven't been able to return to, homes that you're trying to get repaired, and I appreciate your willingness to take time to join us today. I'd like to begin today's meeting with some introductions. First, if you haven't had a chance to speak with or meet the officers of this committee who are part of our Transportation Policy Council, I wanted to give them each a chance to welcome you, and they're being seated at the table now is Commissioner Rusty Sinak, who is the chair of our High Capacity Transit Task Force and the first vice chair of our Transportation Policy Council. Rusty, thank you.
Thank you.
One more time, Rusty. When it's red, you're good.
I guess I'm good. Good morning, and welcome to the High Capacity Transit Workshop. We really appreciate your participation here, and we especially appreciate Metro, Karen, and Tom Lambert. We thank you for hosting us. But also on behalf of the TPC, we'd like to welcome everyone here. We have a lot of important work to do, a lot of planning. We were pleased that the TPC recognized the importance of high-capacity transit in our future plans, and they allowed this task force to be created so that our input will be included in the Regional Transportation Plan 2045. So, I don't think you're going to cover any.
Yeah, I will talk a little bit more about our
housekeeping or anything that we need to do.
I think those are pretty light. There is some coffee in the back room here, and water if you'd like to have a refreshment. And of course, later on in the day, we will be having lunch, and we'll let you know when it's time to go back and get your lunch meal. And then following lunch, we'll be breaking into our different work groups. We'll talk some more about that a little later this morning if you haven't decided which one you want to belong to. But the purpose of our meeting this morning is really have a dialogue with all of you. We are not going to have lots and lots of PowerPoint slides. We'll have a few of them, but this is mostly about learning from each other so that as we start this process, as Mr. Chairman told me several times, as well as the other officers, is let's start from a common understanding of where we are today, what our challenges are, so as we look at high-capacity transit, we can have a most fruitful dialogue about what role it can play in helping us meet those challenges. I also want to invite our two vice chairs to give you some initial remarks. You'll be hearing a talk from one of them, but let me turn to Amanda Edwards, council member with the City of Houston, and allow her to invite you to welcome you as well.
Good morning. I'm Councilmember Amanda Edwards, and I serve as one of the co-vice chairs of the High Capacity Transit Task Force. I think what I want to make sure that we focus on is why we're here. And one of those key pieces is as we have conversations about high capacity transit for our region and really try to get on the same page, it's important that we have the same fundamental starting point in terms of information. And so when we thought about coming up with a task force workshop today, the goal was to make sure that we were able to assemble a lot of the efforts that are going on in our region, but bring it together in one room so that we have one conversation and have one common understanding about where we are to date with various plans and efforts across our region. So I hope that you are engaged and are able to get information and questions answered that you may not have, things that you may not have been aware of prior to, but also that you use this day as a fundamental building block for our conversation conversations going forward in our work groups. As we know, we're going to be focusing on economic impact, questions about transit options or concepts, and then finally we're going to be focusing on funding opportunities for all of those things. So with that being said, I hope you kind of think about those things within the guise of those frameworks, and again, I thank you for being here today.
I failed to mention that we are, thanks to Metro's assistance, we are going to be video recording today's meeting. We'll make that available on the HGAC website. And any presentations that you see today, if they're not already in your notebook, we will also add those to the high capacity transit landing page on the HGAC website, so you can have those for your reference in the future. Our first presenter this morning is also Vice Chair of the High Capacity Transit Task Force, Karin Patman. Karin has been really, for me, an inspirational voice for transit in our community. You have, unless you have been only recently arrived in Houston, you've probably known about some of the real groundbreaking work the Metro Board has led that has reimagined how transit services are being delivered in our area. But the other thought I would say is Karin is always, and Tom Lambert, the Executive Director, always stressed the importance of having regional partnerships, knowing that we are a large and growing region, and that only by working together we'll be able to achieve some of the best outcomes from our investment in transit. With that, I'm going to invite Karin to also welcome you, but to also lead off this morning's presentations. So Karin, thank you.
We're delighted to welcome you to the agency. We have our Chief, Tom Lambert, back there, and appreciate your being here. Thank you so much to the HGAC Transportation Policy Council for recognizing the need to bring high-capacity transit to our region. You know, I think Hurricane Harvey illustrated better than almost anything could how important it is to have high-capacity transit, because what you had with the flooding were highways, roads closed off, and therefore people took alternative routes, jammed up the neighborhoods. If you saw what happened there, you can only imagine what's going to happen when the population absolutely explodes. And we at Metro, under Christoph's leadership from the board, and Clint and Priya and others' leadership, and Kurt Lurson, is Kurt here today, in our planning department and in our implementation department, developed the new bus network, completely reimagined, starting from scratch. And that's what we'd like to do in part with respect to our regional transportation here. Just start from scratch and reimagine. Some of you here were here in 2003. Bob Urey wrote the first referendum in 1978, the first. And yes, you should take credit for that, Bob. It was a great achievement. And then we had another one in 2003 that blessed a pretty ambitious plan, only a small part of which we've been able to implement. But at this point, I think things have changed so dramatically in the transit world. New autonomous vehicles are coming online before we know it. Different approaches to transit are very much in the wind, and while we certainly want to pay deference to the 2003 referendum and the things left undone, I don't think we should be limited by that or confined by that. To me, we should start afresh and look at all the corridors, which of course you as seasoned transit gurus know are points A to B and the swaths of land in between. Not a specific route, but how do you get people that need to get from point A to point B there in the most, in the best route and the best mode of transportation? And the options have just expanded dramatically. So that's what I hope we can all do. Let me just show you a few slides because, of course, this will frame it. If you look at this, this is something done by HGAC. Nobody's better at getting the numbers together that we need to move forward. If you look at the congestion today in the morning, and that's the red, and look at what it's going to be in 2040. It's staggering. There are all sorts of numbers, but this to me illustrates it. Same with the afternoon and early evening congestion. It just explodes. If we widened the Katy Freeway to take care of the folks that travel in that corridor, we would need 41 lanes. It's impossible. So we just have to think boldly. Now, here's what Metro has now, just to frame it for you. As Amanda said, one of our major purposes, and in fact the major purpose of the workshop, is to get all of our collective knowledge together and figure out who's doing what so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing and we can all get together and move forward. This is our current system: rail, park and rides, buses, and I think we have a van pool in there somewhere, don't we? Yeah. This shows you, actually, we have van pools that operate outside our service area as well. The gray is the Metro service area. When we formed Metro in 1978, most of Harris County joined, but the eastern Harris County did not. And we'd love to have you. We'd love to have Pearland. I see Mayor Reed here today. Here's how we fit into the 8-county region. And as it turns out, and of course what we want to do at Metro as we plan our regional transit plan to be part of HGAC's is we want to take into account the transit needs of the 8-county region and how we can best coordinate and connect with those to give regional transportation the most efficient way. Again, we'd be happy for everybody to join. But if that doesn't work out, certainly we want to coordinate with everybody. Let me see. And this gives you an illustration of high-capacity transit and the limitations of current modes of transit. A mode simply being, as you all know, the type of vehicle that takes you. You know, when I got on the board, all this transit speak, a mode, a corridor. A mode is the type of a vehicle that transports you. A car can only take 5 passengers at most. Bus rapid transit, another souped up, John's going to show us how to do it in the Post Oak line, because that's going to have bus rapid transit. Souped up buses that mimic rail cars in a lot of ways. You can have 60 seated, 90 total. Light rail, 80 seated, 170 total. And then commuter rail, which is, as most of you know, rail on heavy tracks. Light rails on tracks with catenary wires that are designed for that purpose. Commuter rail is generally considered to be on heavy tracks, like the freight lane tracks. Can do 190 in a single car. So these are illustrations of the fact that we need vehicles that can actually carry more, and they may be autonomous. They may be platooning vehicles on max lanes. Just to give you an overview of our services, we provide 116 million rides per year. And out of the HGAC regional transit ridership, of course, we're the vast bulk of that. So that tells you what we're doing. So I just wanted to share those thoughts with you today. In the work groups, I know Christoph Spieler, who is on our board but is representing riders on the actual task force, will have a lot of other additional thoughts to share with you that relate to Metro as well. My limit of technology has been reached. I don't know how to turn it off. Okay. All right. Any questions from me about Metro? Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. And we're going to come back and give you a chance to ask questions of our presenters this morning, or for that matter, the high-capacity transit task force officers. And we have some microphones behind me, so we will bring those out to you. We want to definitely capture your comments and questions, and make sure there's an opportunity for dialogue in every part of our meeting this morning. Karin mentioned partnerships, and one of the partners we've had in mass transportation has been the Texas Department of Transportation. I know everybody still thinks of them as the Highway Department. That was their name when I got here 30 years ago, but they're much more than that, as all of you know. They've made very conscious decisions to be partners in many ways, both in the kinds of infrastructure they provide, how it's operated, and their considerations for the future. We're privileged to have Bill Brudnick with us today. Many of you know Bill. He directs the planning, programming, and project development activities for the Houston district, which is the largest district in TxDOT's system. So I'm going to invite Bill to make some comments this morning as well about some of the things they are doing, some of the issues they are facing. So Bill, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan, and good morning. My name is Bill Brudnick. For y'all that do not know me, I'm the Director of Transportation Planning and Development. I was asked today to give a little presentation on high-capacity transit, and I'd just really like to start off by, I guess I'm not telling anyone anything new in this room, that the population growth here in our region is continues to grow at record rates. In 2016, Harris County is ranked number 2 in the nation as far as population growth, and Fort Bend and Montgomery County, as well as Waller County, continues to see this rapid growth. TxDOT, of course, we're trying to do our best to keep up with this growth. We've been fighting it for some time now, and with that said, we do recognize the need for high-capacity transit. We're limited on a lot of the widenings on our corridors. Right now, as land development increases and puts pressure on our systems, we're limited on how much right-of-way we can buy, and when we do buy, it comes at an expensive cost. So we recognize that, and we continue and we value our partnership with the locals. Back in the 70s, I don't remember this too very much, but I'm sure there's people in this room that might. At that time on I-45 North, we started the contraflow lanes. And back then, we would hand-place cones in the morning and in the evening, and we did this in an effort to move people more efficiently. From then, again, we partnered with our local partners, Metro, and that's when HOVs came along, and this was in the 80s. At that point, who would have known that what we started on I-45 North would have led into about 120 miles of HOV lanes. Right now, we had them on I-45, US 59 South, I-10, and US 290. So again, it was a great partnership, and it's been a great relationship. And then parking rides ended up being established around that same time frame. And this high capacity effort that we went through, it helped move people and goods. From there, the HOVs were transitioned to what is known as a high occupancy toll lanes, which were a lot of people refer to those as the hot lanes. The hot lanes allowed the single occupancy vehicles to take advantage of the additional capacity in the HOV lanes, and they're further reducing congestion and improving travel time. Shortly after that, the Katy Freeway program came aboard. We had the Katy managed lanes, which were similar to the hot lanes. It was bidirectional. It's bidirectional. There's 4 lanes. This allowed for buses, HOVs, towed single occupancy vehicles, and this, again, wasn't done as a partnership. We had Metro involved, Hectra involved, and TxDOT, and we managed to go ahead and get that accomplished. To date, we're still partnering. We got the I-45 North Houston Highway project coming on board. We'll be introducing what they call the MAX lanes, which are the next generation of HOVs. With that being said, it affords us the opportunity to accommodate, bus lanes, van pool lanes, and HOV lanes. And we're hopeful that this can also transition into the possibility of automated vehicles in the future. In addition, we are working with our local entities to study the possibility of future rail along that corridor on limits of it. On 290, on the Hempstead part, we've reserved a 50-foot corridor of right-of-way through the public involvement process in our environmental statements to preserve that for high-capacity transit. And we continue to work with the Uptown District on the development of the dedicated bus lane around 610. Outside of Harris County, in Fort Bend and Montgomery, we worked with those local entities, and we placed diamond lanes both recently on I-45 North as well as US 59 South. And moving in the future, we're devoted to continue to working with this partnership and developing transit solutions that work for our region. So with that being said, I just want to thank y'all for the opportunity to be here. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And y'all are letting Karin and Bill off easy without asking any questions. So let me say again, just raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone if you'd like to follow up on any of their comments. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Shirley Ybarra. Shirley is with the Phoenix Infrastructure Group that's assisting HGAC with the task force. But most interestingly, perhaps for this morning, she was the former Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia, if you know that state, has been very active in high-capacity transit. She's going to share some of her experience there, and hopefully the TxDOT folks in the legislature are going to hear her out in Austin, because we'd love them to emulate some of what Virginia has done. Shirley, please go right ahead. You can either come up here or speak from your chair.
No, I decided that technically I didn't need to add to any challenges. I'm Shirley Ybarra, and I'm here with the Phoenix Group, and it's been a real pleasure working and getting to know so many Texans. Now, I do some work on with another group of Texans, primarily from TxDOT, who are a member of a coalition. This is the second time I've been involved with Texas on a coalition. This one has to do with innovative financing, and Texas is very much a leader in that. And now that I'm, if you will, more retired from active stuff other than with what I do with Phoenix Group, it's enjoyable to be on the phone with them every other week. And it's TxDOT, and it's some what we call the renegade states, and a few other states, and some the investment banks and so on. I'm having problems breathing in Houston. It's not the traffic, it seems to be the humidity. Just a little bit of background on me. I started my career in aviation, and I'm from Nebraska, went to 2 Degrees, University of Nebraska. Hate to say that in another football state, but, you know, understand. I worked for with a consulting firm in aviation, and then somehow Washington drew me, and I went to work as Elizabeth Dole's senior policy advisor when she was Secretary of Transportation. Part of it was because I could speak aviation, which has got, if you think that transit lingo is separate, so is aviation. But while doing that, we did 2 things that were really of interest to, and one in particular will be of interest to you. My sort of main focus was getting National and Dulles Airport, which were owned by the federal government, out of the federal government. Congress didn't want to let go, but we finally made it over the goal line. And the other thing, just as I was leaving, we signed a deal, and if any of you have ever been in Washington and been in Union Station, that deal was signed as a development deal. Frankly, folks, it was the first public-private partnership, if you will, that I remember, I mean, in this sort of our lifetime, as opposed to back in the day. Anyway, that is all being done as a development. It's all being funded. There's no federal grant money to it, and that is being funded by the development of Union Station and the rents and so on that are paid in that station for that whole station to be renovated and whatever. In fact, they pay the federal government a certain amount every year for the opportunity to do that. The partners included Amtrak, Metro, Washington, D.C., and the federal government, and that's how Union Station came about today. And I mean, I didn't even know I was working on it then. I mean, that's what it was going to be. Sort of the next, I'll skip over a whole bunch of years. The next thing that becomes important to this group is I was deputy and then Secretary of Transportation in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And something to be said about, I was not a native Virginian, as you've heard, but I went to work as deputy for George Allen and then secretary for Jim Gilmore. As deputy, this was right in 1993, actually 94, when I joined his team, because we're off-year elections up there. And in 93, they had just passed a bit of an increase for the gas tax, the last increase for the federal gas tax that was passed. Now, if you know anything about, or to let you know how federal funding works, the states don't get a pot of money for the year for the highways or transit or anything else. You have to spend money to get reimbursed. Well, that meant that the states now had to spend more money, and money they maybe didn't have, and to get reimbursements. In other words, the match, the amount of money they had to spend to get the money back into the pot. It's not a grant. You don't get a pot of money. They pay you. So you have to spend the whole amount of money to get the 80% or 60% or whatever amount back. Well, Virginia looked around and said, we've got all these projects, but we don't have a lot of ways to start all of them. And so we began to scratch our head. And let me tell you, with George Allen, there was no way Virginia was raising the gas tax. No way. And so we looked around and we thought about, what do we do? And we said, well, if we could spend the money faster and wisely, more, with good thinking, we could do something. And we thought about public-private partnerships. They were just being talked about. This was 1994. Folks, in public-private partnerships, this was a stone age. I mean, way back. And so, I mean, we had great people. but we couldn't figure out how to, how to use the great people that we had and use the innovation. You know what happens in government. I mean, if you need a new computer or you need a new anything, the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic method of acquiring it takes forever. And so we thought about the public-private partnerships, and Virginia has a history of privatization or public-private. They had the Dulles Greenway, which is a purely private road. You'll often hear it held up as a P3. It's a purely private road. I mean, it was Richmond, Virginia, where the first streetcar ran, and it was private. But that's back 19-something or other, or 18, whatever. So we began to look at this, and we said, look, we need innovation in operations, maintenance, and construction. So the Virginia bill, we included all of those, and frankly, we looked at it as a new procurement tool. And so what we looked at was, I mean, one of the things when we were writing the bill, we said, what if that transit station, you could have the daycare center, the cleaners, let's call them, the Subway sandwiches, the whatever. I commuted on the train in New York, from Connecticut into New York for 12 years. And at each one of those train stations, there was a guy there, or a woman, who was selling basically your meal already prepared. And it was a different menu every day. And we said, and I know, it's a fellow that I was working with had also been in New York, and I said, wouldn't it be neat if those train station areas or metros or whatever, I mean, could be money makers all by themselves? Because we knew that transit operating-wise, as we'll learn in some other slides later today, is really not a money maker. But if you could get some contribution from the stations, we thought. So the original even thinking in the P3 bill that we wrote in Virginia was about the transit being involved. So we were the first state, passed it in 1995, and you probably heard it called the PPTA, the Public-Private Transportation Act of 1995. And it's Texas copied it, a lot of states copied it, and we had watched California try it, Washington State try it. California was project specific. Washington State said, bring in the bids or bring in the ideas. They got something like $5 billion worth of ideas. That's how I sold it to my legislature. I could hold up the Washington State and say, look, let us decide what needs to be done out of the projects, because I didn't need any earmarks. I didn't need any direction. I had the Commonwealth Transportation Board. Let them decide. And when the legislature heard $5 billion, that was sort of like pretty good. I mean, it was twice my budget for it. So one of the things that we did in Virginia, and one of the projects that I worked on, was the first hot lanes, and that's in the Beltway, and we converted HOV lanes. The second one, converting HOV lanes to hot lanes down the I-95 corridor going south. We also did the Silver Line, which is the metro. It's about halfway out to Dulles now, and someday we will have metro all the way to Dulles. But that is a P3, and one that I worked on as I was leaving office, and I'm glad to see that it is up and running. That's up and running at least halfway out there. And Tyson's Corner, if you've ever been there, is almost completely changed because of the metro. And with that, I'll stop right now. I'll be happy to answer questions. I'll be happy to answer questions all throughout the day, and I'll be in one of the workshops on financing. And we can talk about, oh yeah, and so we can talk about it a little more then. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Shirley. And is there someone who had a question for her? Yes.
One project, and I'm talking about South America. I think the established ERT system. Okay.
It's Caratiba.
Exactly. When they developed the 5 lines, each line was I think, a hybrid version of P3 in the sense that a contractor came in and said, okay, we want this type of bus, this type of span of service and stuff like that. So I think there are some examples, not just in North America, but throughout the world, I think we need to look at.
There are some others also, and in the, I don't know if it's in our, which group it's in, but we do have some examples. Bahrain is another one, and there's some in Europe also, but with older cities, though, because as opposed to compatible size-wise and newness of the city.
So I think, you gotta think outside the box.
Absolutely.
Are we looking these days for transit-oriented development projects as a part of the financing to get these things? Because I know you kind of alluded to that ridership alone would not be enough for financing of these lines.
The fare box on average across the country, and I mean, is only about 30% the fare box contributes, and that doesn't hit any of the capital costs. So, I mean, you gotta look at that and understand you're gonna need some other contributions or other ways to do it.
Houston is a spread out city, it's a sprawling city, it's a big city. Because of that, is it possible to emulate what you did in Virginia, in Houston? Because of the size of the city?
Well, I added one line to the existing metro that was built in the 70s. And so you can't, the one thing I can tell you, and I'm going to say this to the financing panel, we did it as a P3. We were adding one line. And if you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3. Because every one of them is different. The financing is different. What drives them is different. And the pieces that you have to put together are very complicated. And, you know, I mean, that's why you have a task force like you guys, because this is, I mean, if there were an easy answer, you just hire a consultant and say, okay, that's what we're doing. It's not easy, and you've got an enormous task, but I think you've got one at the absolutely right time as we're looking at the self-driving vehicles coming online. Frankly, I think they'll be here sooner than what we maybe all thought of just a few years ago. And it doesn't have to just be self-driving cars. It can be self-driving vans. It can be self-driving buses. I mean, I don't see, you don't have like all kinds of conductors and whatever, even on the your metro that you're operating. So what we've got, we're right at the right time with a lot of changes coming.
Okay, great. Well, to keep us on schedule, let's thank Shirley for her remarks. And I'd like to go ahead and invite our first panel to come up to these tables. So if you all don't mind just coming right on forward. And then I'm going to turn this over to my boss, Chuck Wimple.
I'm moving. I'm not staying up on the front.
Do a little mic check here. Is this mic working all right? How's everybody doing this morning? Okay, let's try it again. How's everyone doing this morning? That's better. Good. Hopefully be even more energetic after we're done with this panel. Welcome to our meeting today. Our first panel, we're going to talk about business perspectives on high-capacity transit. I'm joined by four folks from across our region that have similarities, but also different perspectives on things. We're going to run this a little bit like the McLaughlin Group. Anyone familiar with that type of show? So I'll be the moderator, and I'll have a few different things to get the group going. Hopefully they'll play off each other and talk about a variety of activities that they have going. First, I'll introduce on my left, Bob Urey with the Central Business District. Bios are in your handouts. You can read those later. And they'll talk a little bit about what they're doing as we move forward. Also, Veronica Chapa-Gorczynski here with the East End Management District. On my right, on the far right, so to speak, we have, it's okay to laugh if you want to. We have John Breeding with the Uptown Business District. And then to my immediate left, Clark Martinson with the Energy Corridor. So as we get started in our discussion, we had a good introduction here from folks, but I'd like to hear from kind of a management perspective, district perspective, kind of what are we doing and how does high-capacity transit intersect with what you're doing and what you're tasked with delivering? And we'll start with Clark. Yes.
The Energy Corridor is on I-10, primarily Highway 6 to Derry Ashford. So if you think of the benefit that the Energy Corridor has with TxDOT's investment in the I-10 corridor, we are looking at the possibility of providing high-capacity transit or new bus service from Katy to downtown, where we would be a significant station along the way. Imagine another station would be at Memorial City, connected to the Northwest Transit Center, which then ties in with the dedicated guideway or busway that the Uptown District is working on. So you could live on Post Oak Boulevard, work in the Energy Corridor, or live in the Energy Corridor and work in Uptown or downtown, and connected to all the other services that Metro offers through those stations. Think of Katy, Grand Parkway, Energy Corridor, Memorial City, Northwest Transit Center to downtown.
Great. Clark, you mentioned the Uptown District. John, you want to talk about Uptown?
Well, I think I came to work there, I believe in, let's talk about a long time ago, in 1986. The very first newsletter a new executive director produces featured transit and what we were going to do about transit in the Uptown area. And that has been a goal of ours and a need of ours for these many years. In fact, we have, working with through our TERS, through the mayor and city council, I see members of the city council here today, literally have taken the responsibility for developing a BRT project on Post Oak Boulevard to tie our area into the rest of Metro's transit system. Transit is essential for the future health and growth of the Uptown market. And we would really have dedicated all that we have to make that happen.
Very good. Bob?
Well, I think transit and downtown are like Siamese twins, okay? I think that the importance of transit to downtown, and when you think about it, downtown was the city of Houston at the turn of the 21st century, okay? Oh, the 20th century, excuse me. And it remains important today. Just some interesting stats, I think, that give you an idea of the importance is this. This is 2013 data, and I don't know how far it might be different today, but we had about 57% of the people that work in downtown basically drive themselves. Our previous survey to that, by the way, was actually over 50%. I mean, under 50%. So we actually, there are reasons, I won't get into them, we can do it later. But we also then have about 33% of folks using one form of transit or another, with 26% of that group using park and ride. And I think that's high capacity regional transit, not the local bus network. About 9% carpooling, and the rest doing something like walking or riding a bike. Those numbers are skewed compared to, I think, the average commutes when you look across the region. And now that we have growing activity centers across the region, I think there's clearly a demand going the other way. And just a very interesting statistic is this. We now have about 7,500 residents in downtown. That number is growing rapidly. The area around downtown, whatever numbers you use, if it's a 2-mile area, it's 60,000 residents. If 3 miles, about 150,000 residents. One of the interesting statistics for those within downtown, that about 58% of those folks living in downtown actually drive their own car to work. And I think that's really amazing. Now keep in mind, by the way, 23% walk, okay? But the reason why so many use their own car, because they work in other locations other than downtown. They actually live downtown, and they work in uptown, or they work in the energy corridor, or they work at the universities, or some other place. So I think that tells us a little bit about how the world is changing now as we go forward. I've mentioned here the importance of park and ride, but let me also say credit to Metro for, after years of us operating in Houston, a local bus network that basically was the same thing as we had as a streetcar system at the turn of the 20th century, okay? Sort of throwing it upside down and begin to create a new pattern that better fits the development and the way we lay out in our city is really important. And I've got to really say we're turning the corner with that, and it seems to me one thing of great interest to us as we go forward is, in fact, the sort of shifting the thinking about park and ride maybe, and that type of service to look and work maybe a little more like what we do with the Reimagined Bus Network.
Veronica?
Sure. My name is Veronica, and I'm with the East End Management District. I brought some brochures at the back table, not necessarily to promote our organization, but because I think they offer a really good case study of how we talk about what we do with our neighbors in the community. And so while our management district offers the various services like other management districts do, we focus on a couple of areas specifically that actually help the residents, one of them being walkability, which has been very, very big the last couple of years, also cycling and biking. So while the difference in the East End is we have 16 miles east of downtown, about 88,000 residents, what I tell folks is we want to be your destination to come ride a bike and have a margarita. We have spent a lot of time, and we say that because we spent a lot of time on the hiking and the cycling trails. But the importance of that, as I know everyone here in the room probably attests to, it's getting people out in the community and enjoying it. And businesses benefit because people drive by or walk by their storefront, and the residents enjoy it because it brings back a connection that maybe hasn't been there in a while. So on the transportation standpoint, I've got to thank both Metro and HGAC because we have the Harrisburg line, 3.3 miles. And from the estimates that I heard from staff, we were about $125 million a mile. And I know we'll have more about the discussion about investment probably later on this panel. But why I mention it is not the significance of just having a line coming through the neighborhood. It's everything around that line. So there's a big focus on public-private partnerships for sidewalks. Can we build a public-private garage? Can we think about walkability? We've planted 1,000 trees. Why do you care that we've planted 1,000 trees? Because we've all been outside in July. It's hot. And so having the shade canopy deliberately, thinking about arcades, those are the pieces that when we talk about transportation, it's not just making it run, or the way I see it, it's how can we support that people are able to ride it and ride it comfortably, because it's good for all of us. We know that the density is increasing and they're coming downtown, and we want to help with that. So in the future, I think where we see some of these services happening, as I mentioned, the garage piece, but also the interesting question for us as an area of redevelopment is we have a lot of empty warehouse space. Are y'all familiar? Have you driven through there? Some, yes, no? So when you have a vacant building that's 300,000 square feet, there's limited adaptive reuse possibilities. How do we make that happen? And how do you do that with current parking requirements in the city? And what do you do when the structure is historic and actually beautiful and the bones are still there? And so the next discussion for us is going to be talking about parking, where we didn't have necessarily parking restrictions lifted or changed when we did the Harrisburg line. We're going to have a conversation about it, because the options are going to be either that we change it, or some of these buildings that we see that are historical are going to have to go. And so there's a whole business case and discussion that, that could be its own panel later. But I'm really grateful to have this opportunity with you all today, because transit matters, your investment matter, your time here today, and thinking about how we do this is critically important, and we can't do this without you.
You know, Veronica just brought up an important point that I think each of you touched on in different ways. She dug into it a little more. I'd like us to spend a little more time on how transformative high-capacity transit, could be for your individual areas, and if you could also elaborate kind of regionally as well too. But John, let's go ahead and start with you.
It's interesting. Sometime I've heard that you want to do transit and encourage transit-oriented development. I think much of Houston, particularly with these major activity centers, we've got the development. What we need is the transit element of that. And so what we have been able to do is to take within the Uptown Galleria area and build a transit system that is not only going to provide regional accessibility, but local circulation and connectivity. We see a very interesting mix going on, that both high-rise residential development and office development are competing for the same square foot of land area to develop in the area. Anything that you see in the Uptown market as a one-story retail center is simply a redevelopment site. We will see the redevelopment of office and residential high-rise dense living in that area, and only made possible because of transit. We've done just about all that we can, working with our partners, TxDOT and the Harris County Toll Road Authority, and even through the TERS and through the city of Houston, building local streets, improving walkability, connectivity. But the one area that we are so lacking is transit. And so that's why this is such a big project for us that we think will be transformative to allow us to continue to grow and bring that growth to the city of Houston, both in terms of people who live here, people who work here, people who pay taxes and help fund government services in this area. So it is the key ingredient for us.
Gotcha. Thank you, John. Bob?
I'll pile on to that. It's interesting to watch John with Uptown. I'm very appreciative of what he's doing. And John, many years ago, you worked on downtown, when you were at Metro. It's interesting to see the impact that the Red Line has had on Main Street. Main Street was really, had become in the, let's say into the 70s to the 80s, even into the 90s, all the development in downtown went away from Main Street, basically. We did everything we could to try to pull it back. With sort of a unified vision of rebuilding Main Street, and also with the initial phase of light rail and the Red Line opening in 2004, I just checked the numbers actually last night, and we've had about $1.9 billion of development just from basically University of Houston downtown to right outside at Pierce Elevated. That $1.9 billion is either within literally the block adjacent to Main Street or the next block out. So it gives you some idea of that swath through downtown. And I can tell you that while we've had a lot of developments occurred over time within downtown, that $1.9 billion is a big percentage. And I think it tells you a little bit about this relationship between how we grow and high capacity transit. And as John said, it's not only the commuting part of it, but it's also the circulation part of it that plays into it as well.
Mark?
Okay, I've worked for Bob when I was at Central Houston, worked for John when I was at Uptown Houston, and now I have this experience working with the energy and oil companies out in the Energy Corridor District. So my perspective is going to be a little different because the West Houston Association created the Energy Corridor District, where you could say the Downtown Chamber of Commerce created Central Houston. Yeah. And so our constituency would be a different constituency. So we're looking at how those master plan communities can get to work without having to drive their single occupant vehicles. So imagine if you live in the Bridgeland and it's going to be, or in Cypress, it's almost 10 miles just to get down to I-10. And then once you get down to I-10, it's another 10 miles to the Energy Corridor, and then it's practically 10 miles to Uptown, or 10 miles from there to get to downtown, a little less than that. So the idea that we would have park and ride lots in these suburban business districts to then provide a parking place so you could get on the bus to go to another business district has changed. Metro now has to adapt and have park and rides further out on the Grand Parkway, and I can see the day when there's going to be the need for park and rides in downtown Katy or in Fulshire or up in Cypress. So these park and rides are now going to become mobility hubs. And I used to think it was a transit center, but Denver Harbor is a transit center, where it's buses that come together to get you from the east, northeast into downtown. So imagine if we have a mobility hub that becomes a shared mobility hub. So it's not just buses, but it's Lyft, it's Uber, it's carpools, it's van pools, and then within a local distance to those mobility or shared mobility hubs, you have like Veronica's saying, the ability to walk or to ride your bike. That's where the transit-oriented development will happen. Now, for us, it's different than downtown. You can imagine downtown, you're taking older buildings, they change their use, they get adaptive reuse. We have green fields around the park and ride lots. So we once, with our master plan, thought we could see that transit-oriented development happen on a park and ride lot, but if you have still land around it that needs to be developed, it's going to happen on that land, and then it will eventually happen on the transit properties that are owned by Metro. So the idea of a mobility hub or a shared mobility hub happening on top of these transit park and ride lots, I think that's a regional change that we're going to see happening.
Clark, while you're on that topic, and I'd like each of you to chime in on this as well too. You're talking about greenfield development. You're talking about changes in how things look currently. You know, certainly John talked about transformation in that regard, and Veronica and Bob. What types of conversations do you have or need to have with citizens and residents in your region, businesses, the public? How do you tackle that part of the high capacity transit discussion?
Oh, you mean I'll never ride a bus discussion, that conversation?
Sure, yeah, start with that.
Well, you have to get on a bus to experience it, to know that it's even a good method to get from point A to point B. We have too many parking spaces everywhere in the city, so it's so much more convenient to hop in my personal automobile to go where I have to go, because I can practically park where I want to go. Today, when I took the bus in here, I was able to have my wife drop me off at the Northwest Transit Center, get on a bus. It was a really quick trip to get here, but I still had a 3-block walk to get from Smith Street over to Metro. So you have to think, how am I going to have a different day by using public transit rather than driving my personal car? My other option is I love riding my bicycle. So if I ride my bike from my home to the Northwest Transit Center, then I can catch the bus that takes me to HGAC. That's a really fast bus. Those north-south crosstown buses seem to be less popular than the east-west long-haul buses. And if I get on the Richmond bus to go back out to the Energy Corridor or West Chase, that's a highly occupied bus, full of people, lots of stops. So we have to sort of not only have the local bus experience that helps me change my perspective that it's possible for me to make my trips without driving a car or having my bicycle to do the complete trip, but I can do sort of a trip chaining experience where I use multi-modes along my way.
What about talking to businesses? Do you think businesses appreciate the opportunity for high-capacity transit?
Well, the energy corridor, the day I started, they said Clark put together a transit plan. So I know that BP, Conoco, Shell, and the engineering companies that support them want to see their employees have that possibility. And then I don't know if anybody has read the Amazon RFP that is out right now. That thing describes exactly the vision for the energy corridor or any really future business center. You're going to have to provide transit for the people that will move their businesses to one of these business districts. So it's imperative that we have transit in our business district.
Very good. Veronica, let's hear from you about some of the conversations with the public and businesses, and then maybe we'll hear from John and Bob after that.
Sure. So, is this better?
Yeah.
So 3 different types of conversations. So one, in talking to the residents when the metro line went in, the challenge that they had is we took out the bus line because we put in the rail line, and they didn't necessarily start taking the rail. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And so part of the ongoing conversation is, what could we have done differently to support the transition so that you would continue to ride the rail? Because we see good ridership, and what people use us for as a destination to park their cars, have a margarita, grab the van outside of NEFAS or the rail, and you go to a game, right? BBVA, Astros, wherever you're going. That conversation is very different from what we're having with businesses, and I'll say there's 2 types of businesses that we have, and we have to think about. There's the business community that needs to operate, that the workers need to come in and out of, and for our area, there's the actual companies that own the commercial real estate around that want to see different types of redevelopment, and the conversation about how that happens is different. So for example, when we're talking to commercial landowners that want to look at their land values go up for sale, right? They're wanting to see what assets are you adding, how are the amenities being enhanced for this particular area? And this may just be unique to the East End because we have to change some of these industrial spaces are just going to change over time. Versus the conversation that even Bob and I were having about workers going back and forth, we know that we have affordable housing and that people want to live, and more people I meet say that they live in the East End and they're coming to destinations to work. And so for us, the critical piece there is, like I'm sure you're seeing in the energy and other corridors, is we just need the transit to move the workers. And as we get more population and more dense, no matter how the conversation gets uncomfortable, we're going to have to come to that realization that people got to move around, and we're not all going to be able to have our 2-car garage with our car parked in it to get us around Houston anymore.
John?
Yeah, Bob, please.
Okay. I think there's sort of two conversations. One, sort of looking backwards, and even to this day, when we talk to employers, especially employers that are in prospective employer that might move into downtown, what we've always found is there's a lot of education involved in terms of having them understand it's very different downtown. You don't need as much parking because there's much more transit available, and employees will use transit, okay? And so that also relates to the employer's policies, where employers are used to either having free parking or giving parking, and downtown parking's more expensive. So, it's like, it's not as expensive because you have reduced demand for parking, so it kind of begins to balance out. But you have to, there's a whole education process in terms of that conversation with businesses in terms of how that works. I think looking forward, what's extremely important, one of the things that we've done over time is one of the reasons why working with Metro, and I'm trying to think back to the minivans, man, that was way back, okay? If you remember, they running contraflow, if I believe I'm right on that, okay? But the Metro trolleys, really, of the 90s, and then Greenlink, which the downtown district actually owns and Metro operates, and we have a partnership there that we work. The whole idea is to make it so that you don't need a car in downtown. There's always transit available to, or you can walk, or you can bike, okay, and for that matter, a zip car. I mean, you Uber, you've got many, many different things you can do, okay, in terms of getting around. What's now, I think, very important to us, and Veronica, it was sort of, you're right there with it, is you have a population within the inner city that I think increasingly will be looking for ways to commute without using a vehicle, and frankly, without owning a vehicle. We have several employees that do not own vehicles, okay? Because they live now in an environment where their whole life can be done by transit, Uber, biking, walking, and we've reached that point, folks. We're in Houston, Texas. This is becoming, it's a small portion of the population, but this is a small and growing. And I think as we look forward, speaking about Amazon, we look forward, we want to meet the requirements of the new companies and new employers in this country, especially within the tech industry. We have to look toward providing that kind of environment, and frankly, not just one, not just downtown, but all over the city.
John?
I think your original question asked, are businesses telling you you need transit?
Yeah.
It's interesting, and let me break that down just a little bit.
There we go.
Yeah.
Got it.
There you go.
Thank you.
You're good, John.
Let's look at who businesses are, what they're made up of, and how they speak. In the uptown area, we are perhaps the most diverse in terms of land use of any part of the city. We're a great office location. We're a hub of retail activity, hotels, and residential. A retail center, perhaps the person that is most sensitive on a day-to-day basis is the tenant. Someone who owns a restaurant cares about how well that you can get into that restaurant during its lunch hour. And that's terribly important. And they often have a position based upon, don't mess with my world. And I understand that. We have a responsibility to make sure that even when we undertake projects, that they can continue in business and thrive in business. But then they also have workers. And those retail workers are perhaps some of the the lowest paid workers in our city. And they really depend on transit. So how can we serve those people and satisfy their bosses as well? And then the third element of a retail piece is the landowner. And the landowners have taken a much longer term perspective, and they are the ones leading the desire for developing higher capacity transit in our marketplace. Look at office buildings. Office buildings, they obviously are supporting transit. And believe me, if we can offer an individual that's working at Williams Tower the ability to live in Cypress, get on a park and ride lot in Cypress, ride it down the 290 HOV lane, transfer to the BRT on Post Oak Boulevard, and never have to drive on the West Loop and on US 290, those people want that alternative and that ability to get to work with a lot less stress. And so then we look at residential. Residential, fairly high income and high price residential development in our area. And I think in the long term, as Bob has said, people, and certainly younger people, are desiring to live some places. They want to live in a place where they can live close to work, where they live close to where their friends live close to where they have entertainment. So having all that together, then how do you get about? Uber is one of those ways, Lyft's one of those ways, but also using transit that's convenient, such as the Midtown area or way we vision Post Oak Boulevard, all works together. So I could take each one of our areas of hotel development. How do we connect to the convention centers downtown? We have as many, slightly more hotel rooms in the uptown market than you do even downtown. How do we connect all that? Transit plays a big part of that, and business, the survival of business, calls for transit to be developed.
You know, a lot of us that deal with community development and economic development talk about image, right, a lot. I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think high capacity does or doesn't do for our image and kind of the importance of it. And Bob, you want to start?
I've heard this for years, okay, and that is we have to have rail because that's the only thing that anybody outside the city really sees or understands in terms of Houston having transit. And I think we've struggled, certainly within downtown, I think we've struggled citywide. We've developed an amazing park and ride system. John, your work, Clark, your work, really are beginning to sort of adapt that and change it and move it to a next stage. But we really haven't done a very good job of branding or communicating our park and ride system, which is remarkable, okay? It is our rail system, and we've invested in it over time, and we've talked about it here. It's developed, and it continues to develop, and we're already, you can tell here, we're beginning to think well beyond that in terms of maybe how it should develop as it goes forward. And I do think from a standpoint of even people in the local community, it's either one of those things where you use it and you appreciate it to death, okay? Or you just totally are ignorant of it. You don't even know it exists, okay? So I think as we deal with high-capacity transit here working in the corridor, I think this issue of legibility of what we have with our high-capacity, especially regional network, I think we have to really think about that whole issue of how does it read, how is it communicated? And a piece of that, let me say, is this. We're hearing it all the time. That park and ride system works only as well as the predictability of when I can get to my destination. Time is very important, so missed schedules, getting caught in traffic with park and ride vehicles and those kinds of things greatly affect the acceptance of that and greatly lead toward people saying, you gotta have something else. It needs to be a rail system, it needs to be whatever, just because it is something we have to be very careful about, because if it really is going to be, the park and ride system does serve as our regional commuter system, it has to have that characteristic and meet that standard of predictability for people, comfort, everything else that goes along with it.
Very good. Veronica, you want to add to that?
Sure. So our perspective is going to be a little bit different in the East End. Because clearly we think about, oh, we're a neighborhood that has rail, and there's the gratitude that we have it. But then it's the predictability in using it and really planning for the riders that use it. And I think that the challenge that we have right now, and why I've heard that we don't have more people using in that particular area, is the distance between stops is too long. And an interesting anomaly for us was informal vacant lots are turning into parking lots. And so I identified with this woman that I saw, opened her car, and it was, a worker for downtown, and she had her lunch bag, she had her briefcase, she probably had what was the equivalent of her mom bag and a pair of tennis shoes and a pair of heels in her purse. And she was parking in the vacant lot. It's covered in gravel and caliche, so the nice shoes are not going to be in that, right? And you have to walk to the stop, get on the train, and get downtown, and she's probably not allowed to walk in sweaty and sit at her desk and receive a phone call or work. And so the reality of this is the image is, it's beautiful, it's clean, we love it, we can take it to games, but the ability to use it as community members, to get into those jobs, there's some limitations there. And that's why, why do we care that there's sidewalks or canopy or these things? It's not just for aesthetic reasons or for a social justice reason that we want to be comparative to other neighborhoods, is that it's proven that these amenities actually help walkers come through and take advantage of this transit. So we know that the image challenge for us is it's acceptable, it's predictable, we're going to make it comfortable, and here's a reason to use it. And that's something that I think over the next 10 years you're going to see really evolve with our area, because the rail line only came in officially, placed in service 2014, something like that, last couple of months of 2014. So it's still relatively new in comparison to other areas.
Clark, thoughts on image of transit, but also how it affects the image of your management district or the region as a whole?
I'll bring it down to workers, because I want them to want to work in the energy corridor, but they may want to live in the East End, they may want to live in Montrose, or they may want to live in Westchase or far out. So I've got to provide some service that gets them anywhere they want to go, anytime. They have to be able to connect to that anywhere, anytime kind of transit service, which means it's not the typical transit that we have today. It has to be this is that mobility as a service concept where it's a multimodal, there's full service, but it's customized for each individual. So it's personalized so that it can be anywhere, anytime. And this is going back to, I have a coworker like Bob was describing, somebody who doesn't own a car, has less ownership than most people do. They perhaps are more environmentally conscious, and so they look at their day-to-day routine and their image of themselves, their brand of themselves as a different person than what we have experienced in the past. It's that's who we have to design for, and that's what we're looking towards.
Very good. John, anything to add?
I love Bob's comment. We have, I think the number out here was something like 120 miles of high-capacity transit already. We need to name it and claim it. We need to celebrate it. It is a fabulous system for the people who are using it. And what the wheel is made of is not terribly important. It's that travel time, it's the dependability, the convenience of service. And I think we have a great system, but we are somewhat embarrassed that it's not as good as someone else's. It's great. There's not a rail system in the world that you can get on and go 55 to 70 miles an hour to your final destination as a trip from in the suburban area to downtown would be. That can't be matched. And so we should celebrate what we have. And so that just gets me a little bit fired up here. Be proud of what we got. Look at what we got. Analyze what we got. And it's real. All right. Last thing. The good thing about a great transit system, and I got to just commend Metro Board leadership, did the most radical thing that I've seen them do since 1978. And that is that they took the existing local bus network, as Bob said, was basically the structure of the old streetcar system, and changed it to reflect the Houston of today. That is a huge answer toward the success of high-capacity transit. For example, Westheimer and Richmond are in the top 3, I think, bus routes for Metro serving this area. Many of our workers either work in Montrose or somewhere like that, or even out toward Voss and Hillcroft, and literally take those buses in and out. Retail workers, restaurant workers, hotel workers, office workers. And our system that's being built today will wonderfully interconnect with that local service and be able to take a Richmond bus in or out from the center city or from the suburban area in, quickly and conveniently transfer to a very convenient, frequently served, BRT running up and down Post Oak Boulevard, and then perhaps go all the way to Uptown Park for their job. It is that comprehensive system that we're all working toward. And we have 2 wonderful pieces. We have a great regional system. We have a great and revolutionary local network system. We are marrying those 2, and I just think we need to look in the mirror and see what kind of great system we have and celebrate it. So I'll now get down off my soapbox.
No, very good.
Can I pile on?
Please, yeah, please.
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious at this point. What you have here is the fact that you can take this park and ride system and reimagine it as 2, such that it runs 2 ways, so that if I'm in downtown, I live in downtown, I can commute to the Energy Corridor, or I can commute to Uptown, okay, with that. And I think the other piece of that is that system only runs basically at peak hours, peak direction, okay? So I think it's sort of time that we begin to say, can it run 7 days a week? Can it run, all day long, so that the restaurant worker, when it gets off at 10 o'clock or whatever, okay, still can use that system to make that trip. Also, can it connect so that it's not just that we're going from downtown to these locations or those locations to downtown, but also you can actually go from the west side of town to the southeast side of town. In other words, it can do more in terms of sort of how it operates from where it is today. When I look at it, and I do not know the number, and I didn't try to calculate it, okay, what the total investment that we've made in the park and ride system here, but if you take that investment, think about what you've already done in terms of CapEx, okay, toward you know, and what you would have to add to that to sort of begin to move it towards this system that can give far more service to this region. And then I think the other piece of that, of course, is we've all said it here, we have to market it, we have to brand it, we have to bring our neighbors in so that they can work under the same brand. There's a whole series of things in with that so that you could get, I think, very quickly and have huge impact, by the way. And that does not really cut off the ability to do other technologies and other modes in the future. But I'm looking at the fact that we need to move. This region's growing, and we've got to be able to do stuff fairly quickly. So I think you can do it incrementally to get there.
We'll go to questions in just a second. Before we, yes. Oh, please. From a Metro perspective? I can't hear you.
Is it on? Okay.
You're on. There you go, Carmen.
One thing, this is so valuable and a lot of really intelligent thinking going on up there. One thing I do want to make sure we cover, though, in the time is what specific, and some of this has been touched on, but what specific projects you all are currently working on that relate to our planning further. Because this is just extremely interesting in the theory as to how we're going to be moving forward, but we do want to know what is downtown Houston doing, what specifically is the East End doing that we should be building into our planning. We know about the Uptown BRT. There may be other things John's planning. Clark, I know that in the energy corridor, and what research you've done to support that. Because I do hear a lot of conclusions, you know, our people need this or we need this. Well, in order to sell a new plan to the public, what research have you done that documents that?
Yes, and actually that's the...
I would just add to that also in terms of the question. I think that's precisely one of the things we wanted to get out of the panel. The other piece of that is anticipating your existing need and then also future needs in terms of either attracting businesses and retaining them in your areas or the residents or the people that you want to come in, kind of tailoring that question to kind of a future need, because we're trying to plan for, you know, out to 2045, and so not necessarily what circumstances exist today, but, you know, using the world as your oyster imagination to tell us where should we really be heading going forward.
Right, and both of those are excellent segues into the final question that I had, or topic, which is all of this is going to feed into our regional transportation plan for 2045. So what would you like to see, you know, over the next 10 to 20 years, and how do we get there, you know, from investment and other types of perspectives? So excellent segues into the final round.
Everybody wants to push the button.
That's fine.
Everybody wants to push the button on that one.
That's not my question.
Okay. Yes, we'll get...
That's not my question. I want to leave here today knowing, and we can answer that question too.
Yes.
But I want to leave here today knowing what each of you is doing research-wise and empirical-wise and planning-wise in a specific fashion, not just a theoretical.
Yes, and we will. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll answer the city councilwoman's question first.
Sure.
I think that tying into high-speed rail effectively, cost-effectively, is going to be very important, and I think there are things underway now to make that happen, but that's simply going to be a highly desired form of travel, I think, in the near term. We are working hard. Again, this is not significant in terms of capital dollars, but we are spending so much of our time about people walking and people biking because we think the transit system is essentially getting in place. In terms, Mr. Chairman, to your comments, what drives what we do is growth in businesses, and so how is this city going to grow, and where are those people going to locate? And I will tell you, the best of minds work on that, and some of them are about 50% accurate. But I think that what you do see, there are there are fads, and then there are trends. And in inner city, higher density development and living is not a fad, it is a trend. And I think that that's an important thing to be able to figure out how to serve. And we can quantify that. And then the other thing is, if we add 3 million people to this region, which is being forecast, if we were to capture 30% of those in the city of Houston, it would be a radical departure from history. Because most of the suburban cities not capturing 30% of all the new growth. And so, but if we were to capture 1 million people over the next X years, we're going to have 500,000 new housing units. Where are we going to put those, and how are they going to serve? How are we going to serve them? So if you ask us quantitatively, those are the kind of numbers that drive our thinking about what we need to do and what we'd ask you to do.
Bob, you want to go next? We'll talk about the long-range planning, but also what you're doing in the short term as well, too.
I'll move from short to long on this. On the short, as I mentioned, we do have the Green Link system we do in partnership with Metro. And I think we've added another route, and we're sort of beginning to say, what is the future there? Should it expand or not? And I'll be honest with you, the issue is, for us, is where it's branded separately, and I think it does have a rider base. It's a little different than Metro's rider base. Where are we replacing Metro service in some places versus not? And it's a really interesting question that we haven't really fully tackled, Madam Chair, so we need to sit and sort of work together to figure that one out. The reason for that is this. We end up, when we look at by age cohort, in distance from downtown, one of the things that's a bit frustrating is that when you live fairly close to downtown, you don't see a high level of transit use. Now, on rail, that's one thing, if you live near rail. But if you don't live near rail, you don't see a real high level of bus usage. And we've got to push that number up. I mean, it's silly not to be able to do it. On park and ride, there's a huge percentage in those distances where park and ride really works. It's gigantic portion of the commuting population that uses transit. The second piece is really working with the curb lanes. What's happened is, and we think about it, so we use shared on demand, so we use Uber, Lyft, whatever. It's got to get to the curb. And what's happened is we have very short blocks, and you actually have on a given street, very short amount of distance in which you can do things functionally at the curb. So we can either have a bus stop or transit stop. We have turn lanes. We have all kinds of restrictions in terms of where you can and can't park and all that. But we have an increasing number of people who are really making drops or pickups at the curb compared to what we used to have because of Uber and Lyft. And so it sounds like a simple thing. It's not. It's extremely complex, especially at rush hour, because you really have lane use restrictions. Basically, you can't stop. Well, that doesn't work for Uber, so how do you do it? Well, they just stop anyway. So I think that's one issue, and quite frankly, it affects Metro too, and it actually affects this issue of predictability for Metro. So this is a little bigger issue as you dig into it. I'm sorry, it's not very sexy, but anyway, it's just what it is, okay? The third, I think, is Michael, tying to high-speed rail, such as that project goes forward, moves in, how do we tie in Uptown Medical Center? It's sort of how do we make those connections in? And then the fourth, and I'll go a little further to say, we have a transportation committee, and it's got some wonderful transportation minds on it, and I'm very appreciative of them, far better than my mind, okay? But they, I think, are really helping to really develop this idea of what does the future park and ride system look like? I mean, what could that really be as we go out there? Is this separately branded thing? Can have multiple operators all under it, so everybody understands what it is. Even if you live in another place in the world, you know what it is. And we talked about Curitiba a minute ago, or back earlier. People would be talking about that just like they do that about Curitiba. I mean, I think that's the thing that we maybe kind of, it's right in front of us, and can we do something with it? That does not, as I said earlier, obviate other kinds and modes further out, but I just want something that can happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years, almost if you look back when we started our park and ride system. So what would that be as we go forward?
We could, Veronica and then Clark, we could have both of you chime in on the questions about how it feeds into planning efforts and also what you're doing now.
Sure.
And then we'll move on to questions from the audience.
So just to give a level setting perspective, the Easton Management District receives about $2.4 million in assessment money every year, and that primarily goes to services that support the commercial properties in the area. So for us to go out and take a portion of that to dedicate it to a public project like a sidewalk is actually a pretty big effort.
Big effort.
So to give you perspective, it took us 13 years to save up $3 million to leverage the projects with HGAC and Metro, and we leverage on an average of about 10 to 1. But if it took us 13 years to get $3 million and you're asking, what can the East End do? We're not going to be able to do this on our own without the investment from partners like HGAC, Metro. So the financial part will need to be a part of the plan. And I can understand the partnership and the local investment we're in, and we're bringing in new partners for it as well. We're asking the TERS, the Harrisburg TERS is new, and asking what they want to partner with and let us help lead some of that. So the challenge is we have 4 things that are on my list, and I should probably preface this by saying I just started in May. So how about I can edit it just a little bit?
That's fine.
The most critical piece that we're pursuing now is a garage at the Lockwood Station, public-private partnership. Baker Ripley is going to go in there, and we need another 450 spaces. So I think we're looking at about 200 spaces for Baker Ripley, 250 spaces that would be for the park and ride. Not sexy. People get upset that we're pursuing a garage. Y'all, we need it. This is one of those things that the information just shows that the need is there because we don't have one to accommodate. The second area that we're going to be pursuing is we need a parking solution for the East End. And I lived in the Washington corridor when they flipped into that parking district. I remember how contentious that was. So if we don't have a parking solution, it may be that we end up in that kind of scenario again, which we don't want to. So I would say forward thinking, we did not get vested in because of the way the land use and the parking code was written in our local ordinances to give us the variances that we need to operate. So I am meeting with commercial and property owners and talking about how do we do that differently. And frankly, they're the ones footing the bill on getting the consultants so that we can look at what those solutions are to the parking ordinance. I'll take that as a sign.
I think, go ahead, hit it again.
There we go. So, the challenge is that for the parking solution is we have businesses that are going to invest and get consultants to come in and say, here's what we think we can do, because we're all trying to just thread the needle a little bit differently for us. So adding and thinking about parking, even if cars become obsolete and they're all driven by themselves automatically by robots, the reality is today, as we make these decisions, I think that needs to be a part of the checklist, would be my encouragement. So longer term, I'm glad you talked about GreenLink, Bob, because a circulator coming through, and the circulator not being just that we want to stay within our community, is that we're starting to share green space with downtown on the other side of the Georgia Brown with Edo. And so this was, let's get rid of the territories and say if the natural space is allowed to get from the Georgia Art Convention Center through Edo, and then we can come through on the green part, coming through Guadalupe Plaza Park, there is an opportunity to circulate there. And so us looking at, Bob, very graciously, you fundraise for GreenLink. And as much as I want to say come to the East End, you can't make money up here on trees. And so we have to talk about what does that financing solution look like, especially with Metro as a partner, because Metro has to be the operator, but do they have to take the burden of providing these? And examples are, I get asked about a streetcar all the time because we have old UP rail lines that are abandoned and sitting in the neighborhood. And we drive on them, on Commerce and Canal, and it's like, again, if we want to use something, what do we do differently with this? The fourth piece that's on my personal list is the connection to the airport. Harrisburg line ends, I know. And those of us that have traveled in other cities, we know that that's the one thing, the criticism I get from friends that come is, where can I grab the rail line to go into downtown, either at IH, at Hobby? And I have to tell them, we'll pick you up. Right? We're just Southern that way. We're going to pick you up. We're not going to put you on a coal train. And I share this because the reality is in 2003, there was a plan to put out there that said the Harrisburg line needs to go to the airport. I know there was a lot of improvements on Broadways in the Super Bowl. My friends were involved in that. I'm not saying that I have an opinion on it, absolutely. I'm saying that the discussion already started 14 years ago. We've got to revive that and make sure that happens, because when you're talking about forward thinking, okay, research and projections, my staff, as small as it is, actually can do in-plan modeling. So we can look at the economic development impacts of developing certain areas. My skills aren't so great at in-plan. I have to ask others. It's the one class I got to be in graduate school because they gave me Caldwell County and I had to look at calculating cows. Didn't do a good job at it. So I was trying to get a little laugh out of you. So I'm not
It's
the
a hard
person
crowd.
to ask your in-plan modeling, but we do have the capacity to do it, and we're proud of that. And when we talk about, what are the projections for population, I have an urban planning background, so I've been pushing to see what can we get by census tract. And the reality is it's always going to be difficult to do because demographers don't want to really sign their name off on that. But I think, Bob, you said it so well, it's exponentially growing, and we don't know how to manage it because it's, what that it is people are choosing to move closer to Houston. We catered a lot to millennials, but I've also sold, take care of that older group that's retiring because they're the ones that really do have the money. The millennials are broke, don't plan for them. I don't know who's right or wrong in this, but here's the challenge that I have. On specifically the population forecasting side, we need to have better understanding of where they're going to go based on the availability of housing stock, not just how impressive the neighborhood is. And I think we do a lot of, people want to live in Montrose because it's artsy, or you want to live downtown because it's cool. I think we're going to have to get better about how we articulate what the advantages are. And I'll tell you the last challenge that I'll say why I think we are going to be a standout is the uncomfortable discussion is Harvey. We did really, really well in Harvey. If you look at a lot of the census tracts of my residents, they're earning less than $40,000 a year, $40,000 a year in those households. And so the whole debate about, this was an area that you really didn't like before, and now all of a sudden you want the housing for it. But, we're pretty bayou adjacent, built high enough that I drove around the Wednesday after the storm, we had 3 high water spots, all like on the bayou. So when you're talking about bringing in an Amazon or future growth of the population or future public investments, I think, Harvey, like Allison did for many of y'all sitting in there right now, it's going to change the conversation for that because we're going to have to talk about resilience and redesign in some instances. So in the forward planning piece, where we're picking up these conversations, I might say as an interjection, did Harvey change the nature of that particular part of the conversation? And how do we refresh that 2003 piece to 2017?
Very good. Clark, you want to give us a few quick comments, then we'll turn it over for questions?
Hopefully quick. Needs assessments, commuter surveys, we do those almost constantly. Recently, Glass House Mobility, we did a mobility analysis doing crowdsourcing. We do social media and surveying of our commute area. So we do that on an ongoing basis. We had to do that to start our car share program. We had to do that to start our bike share program, and we're always doing that with our bus service. We have a master plan with Sasaki Associates and we've done a livable centers study. All this is based on the Addicts Park and Ride and how to create a place that people want to walk, bike, and take the bus and do transit. So we're constantly doing this planning. I'd say right now it's the HGAC's current request for information that they have out, and that is looking at mobility as a service, and it's first mile, last mile, suburb to suburb. That's what we're looking at. So we are. And HDR's our transit planner right now, and so we're constantly working with Metro, a local bus service, as well as what future bus service we could be using.
Great. I think that covered the chair's question. The councilman did want to know about longer range planning. Could you talk about how this feeds into the longer range planning, and then we'll go to question and answer?
Well, TxDOT's going to reconstruct the Pin Oak I-10 intersection. We've been working with Bill Brudnick and with Quincy Allen on trying to make sure there's a park and ride lot that gets built into that intersection. We're working with Fort Bend County and making sure that there's a park and ride lot that goes along the West Park Toll Road. Then you have to provide the service from those locations into the energy corridor for us. So you have to have a place to either drop people off to catch a bus or to park your car to catch a bus. And then we're having a circulator that we're planning that would go along the new road we just finished building, Park Road, that would get you from the Addicts Park and Ride that last mile to your work destination.
Excellent. Now is when we also hear what maybe we should have talked about but didn't by getting questions from the audience. We'll go here, and then we'll go to Maureen. Alan, the gentleman in the gray sweater, and then you also go to Maureen after that.
Okay, one thing about the Green Link. I would like for it to come maybe 2 blocks south so it hits this transit center. And I don't see a lot of Metro customers using it, so maybe some more advertising. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your suggestions. We'll look at them.
Maureen?
Thank you. I'd like to try to tie together a couple issues that have been touched on. One is which all the new technologies and public-private partnerships. I think Ms. Waibara mentioned Tyson's Corner, and there with the redevelopment and the new transit line, or the high-capacity corridor, if you want to call it that, there was a requirement that the new development foster ridership. And we're now seeing new technologies, mobility on demand, mobility as a service, things that will provide first and last mile opportunities. So if public funding is limited and we take the public money and focus it on the high capacity corridors, are the districts or maybe your member companies talking about working with some of the newer technology providers to make the first mile, last mile work so that transit investments can be even more successful? So will the districts do that, or will your member companies contemplate paying for the chariots, which provide shuttles like Uber and Link, where you can just go get a seat and it's running a route, maybe from the transit centers to the office buildings or within your district? Do you foresee that in the future as a way to really have a public-private partnership for high-capacity corridors?
Sure. The first mile, getting from my house to whatever that high-capacity vehicle is, maybe that is something the master plan communities, the HOAs, the POAs, or just the private sector will be able to provide. Then you have a partnership with Metro to get you from that park and ride or Fort Bend County or whoever the transit provider is to the station that's closest to the last mile. And then that last mile would be the Energy Corridor District, either providing a circulator that makes that last trip, or we have contracts with a service provider who could actually be a driver picking you up at the bus and taking you that last mile.
Looking at it historically, I think, except maybe for the transit center here and maybe the bus storage facility up on North San Jacinto, I think we have been a financial partner, either with management district money, TERS money, and in some cases we raised $8-10 million of philanthropic money to be part of changing the realm in which Metro operates, so that the comfort of walking, because keep in mind that's the last mile in downtown. So I think in a sense we already have this model for that. Maureen, as far as financial capacity, we just finished $40-50 million worth of projects, okay? And so, over time, that can be fairly considerable if you really look at it. In terms of the cost of actually service, whether it's Uber or something like that, I will admit, we're not there in terms of a discussion yet on how that really may work. And part of that is just, does it happen in the marketplace? I think everybody's asking the same question. How exactly does this work going forward? Because it may just be that, if it's transportation as a service, that's just something, that's the way you live your life. It's not so much of what an employer does. That's just what, that's just how you live and will be in the future in terms of what mode you want, and you just go do it. You pay for it.
Veronica or John, you want to add to that?
I think some of that, I think we've seen examples that the employer does some of this. Historically, it has shown up in terms of van pooling, and also shows up in ride home. I know some of my son and his friend often take Lyft or Uber to work at times, but I don't see necessarily a management district getting in the business that honestly couldn't generate the kind of funds that would be able to afford transit operations or a lot of the cost. I think we could provide some things like, late night ride home if you use transit. Many companies, many districts are already doing things like that, but just to automatically take on that role of that first mile, last mile, I think that's probably more than an individual business or even an organization could handle.
I think some of our businesses have been great, but that's probably not the right investment opportunity for our businesses. It's probably too expensive for them. But interestingly, I had one business that told me last week that they installed showers in and accommodate for people taking the bike path to work. So I think when, as we get to those opportunities for solutions, everyone's willing to have the conversation. I mean, the limit's going to be really the financial resources to pay for it, and then the justification, the business case, whether it's the ROI, why should they do it, or why would they find the reason to do it?
One little thought, and John, you triggered it, and you remember this because you, I think, were at Metro at the time. In the very earliest days of Metro, let's say 1980 maybe, before the park and ride had really gotten going, all that, we were in a unbelievable mess in terms of congestion in this region. So what happened is you had these massive corporate van pool fleets. They were huge, okay? And what happened over time is Metro came up and the Metro services went into place. The private sector, in essence, pulled back at that point because transit is a public good, basically. They're like, okay, great, we're doing it. But so we have seen times where we've seen what I would say almost extreme response by the private community. The question is should that be the business proposition going forward? Because that is a cost of doing business here in the region. And so at some point, I go to another city where I wouldn't have to do that to make it work. They did it back there in that, let's say, 1980, just because there was no choice. We had to do something and do it quickly.
Very good. Councilmember Edwards, you have
Yes, I just got back from the Railvolution conference, and one of the things I think when we've heard the mayor's talked about transit, and he's talked about illustrations like or examples like Los Angeles in terms of looking at alternatives to the congestion that will build. And so when we look at it and when we think about transit, it's about providing additional or alternative means to avoid congestion situations. So it doesn't mean that congestion will automatically go away because you've now put in a new fill in the blank, but that now people have truly alternate modes so that if there's a wreck on the freeway or whomever's driving the car, it doesn't really matter. If that traffic jam now exists or on that roadway, how do we then get to where we need to go? And so I'm curious in terms of thinking about it from that paradigm in terms of an alternate means around existing congestion or future congestion. What are your thoughts there? And if you don't have anything specifically that you've done around that, that's one question. The second question is, have any of you done any studies with regard to economic impact on your business corridors with respect to the plans that you're describing today? So very different questions.
Your last point about basically the economic impact of transit investment on our area. In fact, we did that in working with our partners at TxDOT. They agreed to come on and fund the piece of the bus lanes from I-10 down to Post Oak Boulevard, whereby the TERS, actually the city through the TERS, is investing about $20 million into that project. We had to, for them, produce an economic impact of the project. And again, I will tell you, you can ask for that. And some of your questions and the chairman's questions have been a bit longer range. I think you are hear from the people sitting up here is that we're really worried a lot about tomorrow. Bob has outed me that I worked for Metro years ago, and I primarily led the effort to do 20-year forecasts of travel demand. I can't think past 18 months now. And I think that's a little bit about we can document and we can look at growth and where it needs to go, but the reality is those up here are really worried about tomorrow, about getting people to work. And so to jump back to your question now, this information source, this little item that we all have in our pockets, you're probably going to have to make that decision about whether you avoid the wreck on the West Loop by taking transit. At the home end, it gets a lot more difficult to make that decision, Pat, once you've gotten in your car and driven back past that park and ride light. It's still possible, particularly if our transit centers have sufficient parking capacity. So you could go, my goodness, the West Loop is shut down. I think I'll either stop at Clark's Attics, or I will stop at the Northwest Transit Center or any other part of the city. So I think that communications and where Transtar is and where we can be with this, I mean, who doesn't travel with Waze by looking at what's going on and making decisions about our route based on information we're getting here? I think that's the biggest impact.
Additional responses to Councilmember's question?
I'll do it. First of all, we've actually not done an economic impact study because the reality is the service, the transit we're talking about and the services we're talking about here are basically essential for survival. That's probably the way to say it, okay? Downtown's worth about $13 billion in tax base to the city of Houston and to the other jurisdictions, and it's growing. I can tell you back in the 1990s, early 90s, at the bottom of the barrel, I think we were maybe at 3 or 4 billion, just to give you some idea of the difference, okay? But if we don't have reliable high-capacity transit, I don't think we survive very well. I think because at least for the next, from forecasting somewhere, next 20 years, it'd be nice to think everybody lived and worked basically in the same area. But I think the thing that what we know today is that the vast majority of those working in downtown still make long commutes, really, and are very dependent upon transit to make those long commutes. Finally, just the one thing about separate corridors and whatever, it goes back to predictability. I think we can share corridors, but if transit is to be used and relied upon, we do need to be able to have it so that it is predictable, schedules can be met, and that. So I think, again, that's kind of, it's design and operation are very much a part of it, as opposed to just mode choice in terms of how that works.
Well, and may I do want to hear from Clark and Veronica, but Shirley does have a very good comment here, so let me.
No, I just have on the study of I'd be happy to supply, and I've got a bunch of cards. I'll hand it out, and you all are welcome to email me. I happen to live on my email, not on my phone, but on my real computer. But I'd be happy to share it with whomever's interested, and it's about the impact of transit on the values, on the values around it. And it's recently done by I think it's the American Realtors, or whatever their group is called. And it's really quite, I just found it, and by accident, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what you guys are going to be looking for.
Yes, and in fact, Metro did a study too at the behest of Jim Robinson, our vice chair, and showed increased property values. So,
thank you. Veronica or Clark, do you want to add to the conversation that was started, and then we'll see if anyone who hasn't asked a question yet has a question.
Well, everybody should work in the energy corridor because it's a reverse commute for most people. I feel so sorry for anybody who works downtown and lives in Katy because I see that traffic every day. So most important, we'll be having some sort of dedicated guideway for the transit vehicle so it can get out of that traffic that is so congested. And I agree, there's a latent demand that's always going to be congestion. You can't get rid of congestion, but you can provide an alternative to that, and that's what transit will provide.
Yep, so we haven't done a study. The congestion is not necessarily a problem, but we have to make an accommodation, interestingly for trains, because of the way they run, and they unfortunately park at intersections. And I had a complaint that a train parked on an intersection and your Metro bus was stuck maybe an hour trying to get people around. And the people had to get off the bus and were hanging out in the street waiting, and the train was parked. So yeah, and that's just a conversation we're going to have because we have rail that's in use and not in use and different just rules surrounding that particular piece. Another interesting challenge, Because it came to not just the congestion piece, but what do you do when you have an actual event or just something of chaos when you don't have the predictability? One of the challenges that we have in our particular area is because of the way we're bounded by highways, both on the west and in the south, and we are a food desert. One of the challenges after Harvey is we couldn't get food. And we couldn't get food to first responders. So I happen to live in the Heights and bought groceries and took it to go help feed Fire Station 17. And this was before, and people were like, oh, but they were barbecuing at the George R. Brown. I was like, this was before the George R. Brown. I went and talked to the manager at our neighborhood Kroger, who was in tears. And I share that because, you know, again, in a historic event where we were bounded by highways, where the highways were not available to let traffic move, you had people that were locked. And we had a couple of restaurants that opened, but not a lot. And so that was, I think, it presented a dangerous just situation in my mind because people were trying to venture out when the mayor was saying stay home because they didn't have access to enough either groceries or other things at home.
Thank you. That melodious tone you heard on my phone was the alarm for the end of this session that went off about 10 minutes ago. But before we wrap up, do we have another question from someone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet? If not, who learned something new today? Oh, come on. If you didn't, then we didn't do what we're supposed to do, and you need to talk to these folks during the break. I want to thank our panelists. And thank all of you. Have a great day.
Thank you. We're going to invite you now to get up out of your chair, come right behind me through the door behind me, and walk back into the back room where we have your lunch waiting for you. Please bring it back into this room, and then we're going to pick back up again with a couple of really key presentations I know you'll want to hear. So please come and grab a lunch.